Hey guys, how's it going? I'm the Duke of Italy, your favorite lo-fi, new haircut music YouTuber. And if you didn't notice, I sure hope you'd reevaluate that, because you know how much this cost? Way freaking more than to be this unnoticeable. I'll just tell you that. But what was a good deal was this sick Have a Hedge T-shirt. Actually, it's way less. I bought this from one Wyatt X Him, who is at Maryland Death Fest right now, which I am not at because I sold my tickets because I couldn't find anyone to go with me. But hey, there's always next year. I can't be too mad. The sun is shining. Well, not right now. It's past 2 in the morning. Of course, it's darkness and depression and evil vibes, because today we're talking about some more death metal, of course. And today we're doing a big one. Probably an episode I shouldn't be recording this late in the morning. Old school death metal. We're finally here. Real death metal. The true stuff. We're out of death thrash. We're out of the early stuff, and we're out of proto death metal. We're here in real death metal territory. And the order of this one's going to be kind of weird today. I'm doing it kind of very similar to the way the chart was done. It was done with a section of some American ones, some Swedish ones, and some other countries and stuff. And I'm going to be covering all those today. It's going to be a long one, double the length of the other ones. So strap in for some riffs. And we're already talking about one of the best albums ever. Seriously, ever. And it's a bit of a deep cut compared to a couple others on this list, because first we're talking about Infester, To the Depths, in Degradation. Who needs any intro for this one? I don't even know if I need the notes for this one, because this album is simply sublime. Chunky as just gumbo style breakdowns, super chunky, filthy early production, which it makes sense because this band would end up becoming another band that was one of the most pivotal gore grind acts of all time, I guess. Formative, I should say, not pivotal. They were formative. Carcass already was doing it, and then these guys started doing it as a different name. I'm not going to say it because it's actually a bad word, and YouTube doesn't like those. So in all actuality, we're just talking about Infestors, To the Depths, and Degradation, which I like for a black metal reason, actually. It's atmospheric. If you look at this album cover, you can probably tell that it's just horrifying. It's really creepy, and it's not overly saturated like a slam album or anything like that, because the vibe of it is just horrible. Look at all those poor little dudes in there, in that pit of soup, and they're trying to eat their bread, and it's getting all wet. Clearly that's what they're sad about, and you can really hear it. The atmosphere of this album is so palpable, it's insane. And that leads to an interesting historical discussion about death metal at the time, because death metal as you know it today has led to riffs and being a suffocation clone, or being melodic death metal, a copy of, say, I don't know, Dark Tranquility, and just going all over the place with crazy melodies, or I guess doing some different subgenre like that, or doing progressive death metal. But here, Infester did something that I don't know another band did very well, because they didn't go the route Immolation went. We'll talk about that later, but they went their own totally unique route, where it wasn't like a harrowing, crazy, scary atmosphere. It was a crushingly depressing one, which makes this album, as even though it's technically death metal, going two ways of influence. If you want a similar vibe to this, I can't give you one in death metal. I simply cannot. One I can kind of give you, Mutilation from black metal, just a depressing, hellish sound, very outwardly apathetic and misanthropic, but it all turns into an inward feeling. It's a very inner and outward mutual sense of disgust, and that's the atmosphere to this thing. And need I say more? Probably not. But I'll tell you what this thing influenced. It influenced a ton of death doom, because it gets really slow. It influenced a ton of brutal death metal, because the vocals are deep and churning, and the riffs are just as deep and churning. And that nice, crispy 90s raw death metal production style, I had to refrain from saying a curse word right there, because this thing is so freaking awesome. I really love the paired, really dissonant tremolo riffs. Really, a lot of tremolo riffs. That was kind of a thing that first wave death metal was doing that death thrash wasn't, is the tremolo riffs constantly. That's a big thing here, but it pairs it really well with the groovy death metal riffs. Like, death metal has a sense of groove to it, and sometimes I just be missing out on that, and here you are certainly not missing out on that. It is here. Unfortunately, it's not a great workout album. It is simply too saddening. But it's great at everything else, and I mean everything. Give it a listen. Like, the only reason I'm talking about it this much is because it's lesser known than the next album and half the albums we'll be talking about today. But seriously, give it your attention. And up next is Florida classic Cannibal Corpse's Tomb of the Mutilated, the one with Hammer Smash Face and a couple others. A lot of really grotesque song titles and a really fun sense of lyrical songwriting. Cannibal Corpse really had that gore thing going for them. They also influenced brutal death metal quite a bit. As some people say, this album's kind of itching upon brutal death metal. Really deep, chunky riffs, and maybe my favorite style of death metal, the bounce, which, who knows, maybe that influenced nu metal somewhere along the line, but just like blast beats that you're just bobbing up and down to. Really fun stuff. Cannibal Corpse has always been a really fun band, and this is no exception. This is also a really pivotal album because the pitch harmonics used on the guitar is so common, and they sound killer. They're produced amazingly. Vocalist Chris Barnes at the time, just roaring guttural grossness, but also his high-pitched screams are impeccable. This dude was a force, so much so that it ruined his voice for later, but we don't need to talk about that at all. Pretty much a perfect album, in my opinion. Bouncy, heavy, chunky, groovy, a subdued thrashiness, but the craziest thing is the catchiness. The fact that these riffs are earwormy. I don't think this album would be as influential if that wasn't the case. Just a lot of really iconic moments that you'll see on only a handful of death metal albums out there. Of course, just not as many catchy moments as Symbolic by Death. And I'm going to mention that every video just in case you guys thought that I had any different thought about it. It's still the best, or at least it's up there. It's really close. Up next is Immolation's Here and After, a quick little 36-minute listen here. And this one influenced a whole lot of what we come to know as dissonant death metal. Stuff like, say, Ulcerate, potentially. I'm sure a lot of blackened death metal gets influenced by this a lot. One band that feels kind of similar is Have a Hedge, Dethrone the Son of God. You know, really angular, and the atmosphere is really palpable, actually. And I know the atmosphere might not have been a direct result of repetition or a particular vocal style, but instead through the riffiness, which you'll see in some black metal bands. And I'm always going to mention black metal bands. Don't get annoyed by it because I'm going to keep doing that. If you don't like it, you can leave. Bands kind of like Deathspell Omega or Portal. Blackened death metal as that weird atmospheric style, I feel like kind of was influenced by Immolation. It makes a lot of sense to me because we're so dissonant and weird here. This album feels particularly evil. And that is a cool thing about a lot of black metal, is it feels atmospheric for a woodsy nature. And like some black metal does feel evil, but Immolation feels just as evil as any black metal out there. Except probably like some Profanatica or some Have a Hedge. That stuff feels filthy. It's technical, highly complex, and brilliantly composed. It's also a style that is very low in chugging, but it's certainly still there, that like open palm muted, low down-tuned power chord, if you will. And if the black metal influence didn't stop there, a lot of really awesome tremolo riffs as well as Norwegian-style bar chords. The vocals for me, I wish were mixed a little differently. They are really, really clear. They're probably the clearest vocals you'll hear in a death metal band post-90s that isn't a Death. Because Death, you know, you can hear all the stuff because he has like a sort of screamy style. But like most death metal vocals, I can't tell what they're saying. Immolation, you really, really can. And part of me, I was like, I don't really want to hear it so much. I feel like I should be looking for the words, but it works out really well. This album is great. It's honestly a band I need to get more into just because they have so much stuff going for them, but classic 90s Immolation is unstoppable. And then we have Morbid Angel's Altars of Madness. It gets as classic as it gets right here. This album feels a little bit different from these other ones here. The chunkiness is not as pronounced. You get a lot of tremolo riffs, a lot of thrashiness, and a lot of really deep, thick, chugged power chords and some more screamed vocals. The comparisons to death are certainly there. If you desire a bit more heaviness in your death metal, tracks like Maze of Torment certainly can still be up your alley. There are riffs aplenty on here. This is another death metal album that is definitely not in the death metal sphere yet, where it was just kind of formulaic and struggling due to that, and you just judge it purely by the riffs. But because these are earwormy and catchy and really interesting like that, so what you get is actually something very, very appealing. So you get something really awesome here. The guitar solos remind me a lot of Kerry King, just sort of weird flourishes of whatever, but they fit the energy so well. This is a decently atmospheric album, as it feels so evil. I don't think it feels as evil as Immolation, but this is certainly a banger by every respect. And this is also a band that has a really underrated back catalog, not one that I've explored enough, because up until like the 2000s, they were doing stuff that was pretty solid. So I have to give this one a great, not only because I love it, but I think I honestly have to. Fortunately, I don't feel dishonest giving it that. It's freaking Morbid Angel. Like, what is there I could say that hasn't been said? And up next is Obituary's Cause of Death. Obituary is a band with a really, really solid 90s output. Their later stuff no one really talks about, but Cause of Death is highly seen as their best album. And, I mean, I'd be troubled to disagree. It's very solid Floridian death metal, and it sounds like it. It sounds like sort of a mix between a lot of these bands we've been talking about so far. As much as it is very much cookie-cutter death metal, as long as you look at the traits of all these around them, one huge highlight is actually the guitar solos. They're extremely technical and also work perfectly. They don't feel like Kerry King. They are used for riff reasons. They are, if you're into progressive music, then this is absolutely for you, but also it's just because they're good. They are very solid guitar solos. There's a beautiful contrast between the higher pitched riffs and the lower ones, because however they mixed it managed to be amazing, because it has so much oomph behind it. Just a lot of power in the lower tuned power chords here. The vocals actually remind me a bit like Chuck Schuldiner, a bit screamy. The song Dying is also a huge highlight. That's one I will definitely be returning to many times in the future. It is also very consistently just riff city, something I'll be returning to in the later, because that is just my style of death metal. And if you can't tell, this album's pretty great. US death metal is really doing a number. Of course, I think Infester and Cannibal Corpse are the highlights for me so far, but we have one more album in the US category, and it is Incantation's Onwards to Golgotha, sort of a reveal of the New York death metal scene, which has a few bands for you. And there is like a couple bands out there that don't fit into this New York style, but I'll say Incantation first of all, and then you could even see through black metal lens, Profanatica and Havahedge are from the same scene. If you know what they sound like, you can probably predict compare them with every other black metal album. Just go with that, and you could probably tell the trajectory of what's going on with Incantation. Here are their contemporaries: Suffocation, Skinless, and Mortician. That's really all I need to say there. As you understand the contemporaries, and you kind of know a bit of a direction we're going here. Yes, Incantation is so stupidly heavy that it's a bit funny, actually. And here's my hot take. I think their latest album from last year was awesome. Incantation's always been sort of a death doom band, but kind of skirting along that sort of title, and their riffs are just so down-tuned and slow and trotting that it is insane. But also the amount of riffs they can stack upon themselves without being too repetitive is crazy. I don't know how these guys remember this stuff, but it is very impressive. From a mixing standpoint, this thing sounds utterly amazing. The vocals are so cavernous. That classic ripping chainsaw guitar tone. I don't know the pedal setup here, but I would assume there's like a DS2 in there. If that existed at the time. I don't know pedal history, but like that Swedish ripping style of sound, I feel like it's here, just even more down-tuned. It's really insane stuff. Blast beats are insane on this one, really fast. And of course, pitch harmonics, just the best. So this album certainly has more of a rhythmic consistency than a melodic one, but the guitar solos are also deeply emotional and more on the low-pitch side. They are doomy and longing and looming and dooming. They're good. They're really good. And this album is just a bunch of bangers. I'd have to say Entrapment of Evil is my favorite track here, but really you could take your pick. They're all fantastic. And with that, that is actually the end of the American albums. And now we're moving on to Sweden. And I'm going to tell you right now, it's a pretty impressive lineup. We are missing Unleashed, so Unleashed needs to be here. There's also different Swedish death metal gets mentioned later on this chart, and some American death metal gets mentioned later, but that stuff kind of fits more into different subgenres, so we get in those later. So I should probably mention that now, is if something's missing here, I didn't come up with this list. Also, some things aren't just old school death metal, or just traditional death metal, or regular death metal. If you're going to complain about it, I already know what you're going to say, and it annoys me preemptively. But first, we get a band that I was supposed to see at Maryland Death Fest this year. This is Dismembers Like an Ever-Flowing Stream. Can you believe that I couldn't see them? Because this album is flippin' amazing. So this is a really cool thing here because it sort of leads us into the more melodic style of death metal, as this album is very melodic, but it's full of aggression. The momentum behind this thing is really, really impressive. And the guitar solos don't feel like the Kerry King stuff. They feel extremely purposeful. There's really crisp production. Honestly, it sounds great. And these really bassy tremolo riffs are really impressive. They honestly are some of the best riffs in the game. And if you take a coin and on one side of it is Norwegian black metal, this, as Scandinavian death metal, seems to be the exact archetype of that opposite. It feels like it does everything black metal does in a death metal context. I'd say In Death's Sleep kind of shows off as a bit of a highlight just because the riffs are way more doomy than any other on the album, but the riffs are truly top-notch quality. You get vocals on this album that are kind of deeper than black metal vocals, but they're not quite Cookie Monster stuff like the American scene would have a lot, so you're kind of in between there. And it's also not like Morbid Angel, or at least early Morbid Angel, or Death, or Obituary. It's kind of that sort of in-between thing here. But they're great, as is the rest of this album. And next we get a real classic, one that I was looking way forward to, Entombed with Left Hand Path. One of my favorite album titles ever. Look at this album cover. This thing's like so mysterious and eerie. I remember seeing it for the first time and I was like, this doesn't even look like death metal to me. I don't even know what it is, but it sounds fantastic. It's very punky. You do a lot of two-steps to this thing. It's pretty awesome. And it is fiery. You don't need me to tell you that it's heavy, but there's a really thrashy, aggressive pace to the whole thing with these really thick chords used underneath. It's not as much like syncopated and chunky like brutal death metal, but it's just really powerful feeling. And it gets really, really melodic when you least expect it, which is actually a really fun thing to hear. The guitar tone on this album is a thing of pure beauty, one of the best in the game. Every track has something to like. It's seriously one of the most varied death metal albums I've heard ever. I also like how extremely bouncy this album can get. It's not something you expect all that much, but it gets bouncy. I also love the bass tone and how percussive and clanking it is. It seems kind of before its time. And you'll end up hearing bands like Cryptopsy use it a bunch, which is really, really fun. And if you don't get anything from this whole video, please listen to the song But Life Goes On by Entombed from the album Left Hand Path. It is one of the best death metal songs ever. It's so awesome. Entombed in the Swedish scene really brought a really cool emotional angle to the genre that the American scene didn't have as much of. America's whole thing was being evil, but Swedish was still being kind of evil, but like in a philosophical way, I guess. If that's not your thing, it's not your thing, but I like it a lot. And of course, just a great, great album. As we course into the next Swedish band, Grave, with the aptly named Into the Grave. Now this one, if you wanted more American style, this one kind of gets a little bit closer to that stuff because it's a really thick and dense production style, and everything sounds guttural. Very low-tuned tremolo riffs, seriously just swamp. All the songs feel as complete as they should be. None of them feel too long or too short. They're all just under 5 minutes in length, so you actually get a real sense of consistency on this album. But some tracks actually get really, really brutal in terms of the context of the rest of the album. Like tracks like Obscure Infinity carry a lot of heaviness to them that has a high contrast with the more melodic and punky style with the rest of the album. And I really love my blast beat and tremolo sections, which there are so many blast beats on this album. Like blast beats are probably 60-70% of this whole thing, but there are a lot of times where you get some really cool, more syncopated riffs, which that might is a slippery slope for me. I don't like too much syncopation in my death metal because then it leads to other more unlikable subgenres. But what you got here is some sublime, really heavy stuff. Graves Into the Grave is great. And our last Swedish death metal album of the day, believe me, I wish we had Unleashed as well, or I don't know, Fester or a band like that. We have Gorement with Never Ending Quest. What a weird title for a death metal album. You don't even know what to expect with this thing. If you want something like My Dying Bride or Early My Dying Bride or Catatonia's like playing style, but you want like the Autopsy style of production, this is a thing for you. This thing is death doom, basically. Maybe not fully there yet, but it's pretty close. The bass is very, very prominent in the mix, and the riffs are so doomy. But the lead guitar is also a really huge highlight that is pretty underrated. The best way I could describe it really is Cannibal Corpse minus the bounce and more fast-paced tremolo riffs. It's like melodic Cannibal Corpse because it feels just as filthy, oddly enough. And the guitar tone is just so stupidly heavy. It's a really thick chainsaw guitar. Silent Hymn is my favorite track here. It's so bass that it hurts. Even the latter half of this album feels a bit triumphant at points, so we're getting some emotional dichotomy, something I have not seen before. Obsequies, or however that's pronounced, of Mankind is another fantastic highlight, one of the best death metal songs I've heard thus far. This kind of just goes to the serious, insane quality of old school death metal. If you look at old school death metal, be it the two American scenes plus Swedish death metal, and you compare it to Norwegian black metal, it's pretty neck and neck. Like all these bands with their 90s outputs were almost untouchable. And just letting you guys know, even though I'm ranking all these good today, I would rank these 4 Swedish albums neck and neck with the best of those American albums. So yeah, those Swedish albums are really something to look at. And then we're going to some other European locations, which I find the quality to sort of be a bit mixed. And I want to give a little aside here. Some of these albums are weirder, and I just kind of wasn't used to them that much. So my opinion might change with a re-listen. I don't want to give too much of an aside. Don't want to sound like I don't know what I'm talking about. But I have learned more death metal since listening to these originally, and they felt just too weird at the time. So maybe I'll like them more next time. But some of them I was mixed on. But Septic Flesh's Mystic Palaces at Dawn is not one of those albums. It's Greek, Gothic, doomy, and a bit symphonic, something actually really, really unique, and something I should totally freaking hate. I hate symphonic metal, but every section here feels so creative. It's like, yes, please give me some more, actually. It does feel a bit silly occasionally, in all honesty, but it's so beautifully melodic, I really can't hate on it. The guitar solos are straight Kino, and this album goes for almost a freaking hour long. This thing is insanely long for the time. Behind the Iron Mask is atmospheric and a bit spooky, actually. I remember being like kind of creeped out by it, but it's mostly a straightforward death metal banger. This album, really unique one and a weird one. Not a band that you'd see me return to that much, and definitely not one I'd be playing in front of the ladies, but you know, you should listen to it yourself because it's really great. And you know who else is great? Pestilence's Consuming Impulse. This one is awesome. What is this? Martin Van Drunen, I think, who went on to do Asphyx, I believe. Could be wrong, but Asphyx is a band we'll be talking about at some point. They're also very important. It's punky, thrashy, a bit noisy, really cool stuff, and very yelly style of vocals here. It feels almost like hardcore punk, and you have very unique rhythm section here. The rhythm section is actually very unique. It's almost hard to describe, but it feels not like any other death metal scene you'll know of. But instead of being like, I don't know, Grave, where it's just blast beats forever, this one has swank beats forever. It's like thrashy. There are a couple parts on this album that feel a tiny bit uninspired, but it's enough to be ignored. It's just really not something that shows up that much. It's just shows that it's part of death metal in the 90s. If anything, this album has a lot of appeal as a thrash metal album, having a lot of really surging energy, a lot of really fun riffs. It's another great one. It's got some decent heaviness behind it. I think Asphyx gets heavier, but I could be referencing something that doesn't even matter. So that's my take. And up next is the band Molested with Bloddram or whatever. This one's Norwegian death metal, and it has one huge glaring problem. Bad production. Yeah, it actually tried to do the Norwegian black metal thing and use bad production. It's not as bad as Norwegian black metal because it's death metal in this case, and it flounders as a result. Buzzy and fast paced, which makes sense because it's only 36 minutes long. Really fuzzy and fast paced tremolo riffs, which is so indicative of Norway at the time. It's like they were basically doing the exact same things the Norwegian black metal bands were doing, but just down tuning it, making it a bit more syncopated, doing more grounded blast beats, slightly deeper vocals, taking a lot of influence from their Swedish death metal contemporaries as well. But there are a few things that really drag this thing down. It's the poor, crunchy production style that gives it no oomph, the vocals that just don't really do anything for me, and the guitar solos, which are just terrible. The guitar solos truly are like lacking in any skill at all. My favorite part on this whole thing are the interlude sections, which are like weird Norwegian folk bits, including Jews harps being played. That's my favorite part. Which, if your favorite part, that's not a good indicator of the quality of your death metal. So I think Molested's Blood Drama it's okay. It feels like it's LARPing, which when LARPing is your strong suit, I'm like being generous here. Next is Demigod's Slumber of Sullen Eyes, which is Finnish death metal, which has some variety and some really pummeling riffs, which to me kind of struggles because it can't pick a way to go. It's certainly cookie cutter death metal, but it's not too melodic or atmospheric, and typically not that heavy either, which Transmission Beyond Eternity is pretty heavy, but other than that, it's kind of lacking in that department. Probably my biggest complaint about this thing is that the riffs seem to be either tremolo or slow. Not a lot of in between. It's the lack of variety for me that's a real problem. It's like a 50-50 dichotomy instead of something a bit more creative. But I do like the slower sections a decent amount. I think that's sort of the most creative thing here. So I guess, tempo changes are something that's really interesting. It's sort of building atmosphere in a weird, different direction. So I think this album's good. A lot is going for it well. I like the vocals. I think the riffs melodically are decent, but we are technically done with old school death metal. But for some reason, this section tacks on 2 more albums instead of one of them being Unleashed. It's neo old school death metal, which is just death metal. It's just regular death metal, which it is important to note that these albums here don't have a production style that feels wildly modern or wildly clean. It's cleaner. It certainly has a lot of homages to old school death metal, which how could you not? But it makes me wonder the validity of them being here, which will start with Funebarum's Sleep of Morbid Dreams. The mixing already shows a serious improvement over old school death metal properly, although this thing's like way later than that stuff. It is crisp, relatively clean, but the low end is fantastic. There's so much being held together there. It sounds genuinely great. Every song progresses fantastically. I feel like they have a perfect writing style, and they even go melodic exactly when they're meant to. It definitely has a good variety, which maybe it's a little clean cut and a little bit predictable like that, but when it goes melodic, the melodies are fantastic. And I don't talk about it enough on these videos, but the drumming on this one is truly incredible. It's really in the pocket. It plays everything it could be playing and more. It's really great. This album's strikingly heavy for the old school death metal style. New Monumentum as a song sticks out even further in that regard, which is a reason that it's a highlight in my opinion. And this album is a highlight on this chart. This one stands up to those really excellent old school death metal albums. This one is fantastically great. And the last album we're discussing today, finally, I feel like I've been here forever, is Disma's Towards the Megalith. It's an album we got to talk about. So with that really prominent bass tone, you get an ever so slightly doomy presence here, maybe some Autopsy influence, I guess, and overproduced caveman riffs, because that's what I want with my caveman riffs. And it is fun structured, there's a bit of variety in that, and not a lot to really go off of. That's kind of most of it. There is one huge highlight. It's the Incantation vocalist, and he sounds incredible. His growls are so deep and still decently cavernous, but the thing is, I'm not getting riffs that I really care about. I'm not getting instrumentals I particularly care about. This seems kind of like a throwaway side project that I don't know why I'm even talking about, so I'm going to stop talking about it because it's just okay. And you might be wondering, Duke, you sure covered a whole lot of old school death metal albums today, but there's so many old school death metal albums that you missed. I'm aware. That's because next time we'll be covering some more things in a different category. And I want to give one more disclaimer. These upcoming sections I did not make just as much as I didn't make these previous sections. So I'm sort of, they might feel a little bit out of order to you guys, like they shouldn't be in one thing and they should be in another. I am doing a critique of this chart, and so far it's going swimmingly. A lot of great albums. Couple hiccups at the beginning, but this old school death metal section is largely fantastic. And I hope I just gave you guys some new listening material, because you probably know Cannibal Corpse, but maybe you should listen to Infester, because it's about as good, even though it's pretty different. And Swedish death metal needs some love too, just because they do, because they're that good. And other than that, not sure what else I'm going to talk about, but I guess I would appreciate it if you left a like and a subscribe. Any comments, questions, or concerns down below. What's your favorite old school death metal album? What's your favorite old school death metal band? What's your favorite death metal album or band or metal album or album in general or band? Or do you even like music? Sure hope so. Discord is also in the description, as well as my Instagram and X, and join the Discord. It's great. You'll love it. Anyways, that's about it. Hope you guys enjoying your day. Have a good rest of it. Bye.